everybody.
Just want to say hi, Paolo.
Dear friends and colleagues, a very warm welcome to tonight's linguistic flash mob organized by Linguistic Aperitif Group. Although the hardest times of the COVID-2 crisis are apparently behind us, we think that this initiative has been well received by the linguistic community, and we want to continue our experiment of scientific proximity on the basis of this environment-friendly virtual but nonetheless real connection. So we continue exchanging ideas for scientific research to grow. Today, we have invited two well-renowned colleagues, Gillian Ramchand from the Arctic University of Tromsø and Hagit Borer from the Queen Mary University of London. They will discuss a topic at the interface between syntax and semantics, namely event structure. As usual, they will exchange ideas and give us their view in the form of a contest. They will answer 3 questions offered by the moderator, David Adger from the Queen Mary University of London, and have 5 minutes each to give us their answers to each question. At the end, the moderator will summarize and comment the results, and we open the discussion. For security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing facilities have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask a question, they can send it to me via email. I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a later reply. The event is being streamed on YouTube. So if you ask a question, you are giving your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link of the YouTube registration you have received with a flyer to students and colleagues and post it on social media. For those of you who are looking at us from YouTube, you can also ask questions. Just send me an email message to ceciliapoletto@gmail.com and I will ask them for you. And now I leave the floor to David Adger, who will moderate the 4th epic battle in linguistic history.
Welcome, everyone. This is an epic battle that I'm very excited to hear about. As Cecilia said, we're going to be discussing a topic at the syntax semantics interface, and it's going to be discussed by 2 of my oldest friends in linguistics, Hagit and Gillian. The speakers have chatted beforehand and decided to take the questions in a slightly different order from what is actually on the poster. So the first question is going to be how thematic roles are encoded in the syntax. The second question then is going to be, what about verbal decomposition and argument structure? Is that differentially encoded, or how is that encoded in the syntax? And then finally, we'll end up with what is the representation of causation and agentivity. So there's a slight difference from the order on the poster. I'm actually not going to do any background to start with. I always feel with these things, when I come to them, I want to hear the speaker and not so much the moderator. So I'm going to really pass over now to Hagit, who's going to start off with a little bit of background and then her answer to the question of how thematic roles are encoded in the syntax. So Hagit, over to you. You'll need to unmute.
Okay, so now how do I, okay, where do I go now for screen share? Okay, screen share. It has disabled, my screen share is disabled. We went through this. Cecilia, are you there? My screen share is disabled. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, Hagit.
Okay.
I can't hear Cecilia.
Giacomo, could you please turn her into co-host so she can share her screen? Thank you.
Yeah, she should be already allowed.
Okay. Can you see this? Yes, you can see this. I need some.
We can
yes,
see it.
Okay.
We can see it, Hagit.
Okay, I will start with a bit of an introduction, but also I think that at least the first part of what I have to say would not necessarily be an epic battle with Gillian. It will be, I hope, an epic battle, but I'm not entirely sure that who I would be battling would be Gillian directly. I actually want to give a bit of a background about what where roles come from and where interpretation of argument comes from, because we have moved not as far away from this as people might think. So, okay, my screen sharing just went off.
Someone else has apparently started screen sharing.
Yes.
9QWZDR.
I kicked it out of the meeting.
Okay, try again, Hagit.
Okay. Okay, you see it?
Yeah, you see it.
Okay. So the very beginning, and that's basically the transition that we had from what came before aspects of the theory of syntax in 1965 and what marks syntax is, and what marks aspects relative to argument structure, is that we have arguments constituting a context for an insertion frame for verbs. And so what you look at in 1 and 2 is you're looking at some kind of a scheme for phrase structure, which is a generalized scheme. And then you have the insertion frame for read, whereby you're inserting read in a particular context, in the particular context of what today we would say the argument that it selects. But that context will give us basically the arguments of read. And in this particular sense, we can say that the lexical entry for read is a sort of filter on the phrase structure in 1. It will tell us which instantiation of the phrase structure in 1 is the appropriate one. If you look now at the verb head or the noun head in English, you have examples in 3, you will see that in this particular representation, the insertion frame for each one of these elements is completely distinct. One of them will give you a direct object, one of them will give you some kind of a goal, and the third one will give you a noun. And so at least within the framework of aspect, there is no particular way in which we could say that this is the same item. And not only that, but Chomsky actually goes out of his way to state not that this particular generalization, but the generalizations like that are irregular. They're properties of lexical entries, and hence they are in the lexicon. And you will see this at the bottom. Thus, the lexical entries constitute the full set of irregularities in the language. And if you look just a little bit further up from that, you will see that he's explicitly excluding semantic information from this. So semantic information such as that we could say that there is something about the direct object of head that makes it a direct object, as opposed to a PP or something like that. That's not in aspects, and that's explicitly not in aspect. It's not that he somehow didn't want to forgot to put it in. By 1970, he rethought the issue, but the 1970 article kind of is talking from a little bit from the two sides of its mouth. And by 1970, there is actually an attempt to combine. And what you have in 1970 is very much a proto-root. And in fact, if you look, let's say, at Moran's 1997, this is his concept of what a root is. And a root does not have a category. It receives its categorical specification from the syntax. And a root has a complement. So a root now, this is no longer strictly speaking an insertion frame, although it could be. What it is a relationship of which we would today call a selection, and the relationship of selection is constant across the instantiation of the root. Okay. Okay. When we look at least a little bit further than that, we have basically the 80s are marked by an attempt to derive insertion frames. What we had in, for instance, 1965 is just a list, deriving this from some kind of semantics. You have a quote, a very important quote, I think, from Pisetsky's dissertation. And this particular quote sets up what I think is really at the back of a very, very influential agenda for lexical semantics. And that is the idea that things such as theta roles, things such as roles, they are epistemologically prior. And because they're epistemologically prior, then we want to derive the grammar from them. There is a particular very strong claim here, which I'm not sure everybody would necessarily endorse nowadays, and that is that the structure of the grammar is to be built from things that are epistemologically prior. I think a lot of people, for instance, when you look at the big discussion that's going on, let's say in cartographic approaches and elsewhere on the order of functional projections, this is clearly not, at this point, we don't know about the future, but at this point, there's no attempt to claim that this is deriving from something which is epistemologically prior, or that in general, there are per force things about what we call narrow syntax, which need to be derived from things that are epistemologically prior. So this is a claim, it's an important claim, but the claim may or may not be valid. That led to a lot of very, very important results. And so I think that when you look at the achievements of the, David, when did I start?
You've gone for 4 minutes and 55 seconds.
Okay, I don't have much left. Okay. When we look at what happened next is we see a very impressive, I think, list of results that come to us from the attempt to understand at greater detail the properties of argument structure. You have a partial list of constructions just in English in 9. In order to kind of, and plus we have principles like Utah, for instance, that tell us how to negotiate the relationship between selectors and arguments. And I want to just skip directly further and say that in actuality, one could, excuse me, one could adopt the results of the lexical semantic agenda without adopting lexical semantics. Because the question then becomes not a question of what assigns the particular roles that are being assigned, let's say in 9A through E, but what syntactic configurations do we have in something like load the hay on the wagon as opposed to load the wagon on the hay. And these configurations in and of themselves could give us the kind of interpretation that we are looking at. This would not be epistemologically prior, because this would say that it is the structure that gives us the interpretation, and that the structure is not necessarily epistemologically prior, and certainly not through lexical semantics, but it would still give us the association of roles with positions. It's not identical to Utah either, so those of you who thought about it know that it isn't. Okay. If we move on, the question now becomes the choice between 11A and 11B. In 11A, as determined by some lexical head, possibly a root, patient, theme, affected object, subject of quantifiable change undergoes whichever labels you choose to give these things, give us a particular structure P, and that's basically the lexical semantics agenda. Because patient is a patient, it would be in a particular position, because affected object, if you wanted to call it this, is in a has particular interpretation as selected by the head. It will be in a particular position. The other position is in B, and that is the structural fragment P is interpreted as patient, and the mediation with the selecting head is not necessary. Okay, so that you have a structure specifier of alpha, for instance, is a patient, and then we need to ask what alpha is. I want to stress that this is not an obsolete question. It might seem to you like an obsolete question, but it very much is not, because it is true that most people no longer have a verb that is listed with its arguments, but a lot of people have roots that are listed with arguments. This is, I would say, a very, very common assumption within DM. Certainly Harley has put this forth very powerfully and in a principled way, that roots select arguments. And, and this is very, very common within much contemporary work within DM. And on the other hand, you have the approach that I would say, relative to the context this evening, is probably certainly associated with my work, but also I would say Gillian, and that is roles that do not come from any information that is listed either with a root or with any other kind of listed head, however you choose to list it. And yeah,
you're kind of edging towards the end of our agreed time.
Okay, okay. And so the question is an important question. And what I will finish with now, as you will see, I don't have much to say about question 3. So if people would wish me to, I could come back to this. If you're looking at a structural configuration, the structural configuration would be roughly SN15. You have some specifiers, let's say alpha and beta. You have in this particular configuration 2 arguments. And the question that now becomes, the question that now becomes, I'm getting some interruptions. The question that we now need to ask is relative to a structure such as 5, what are alpha and beta? What are argument 1 and argument 2? I mean, the agent, whatever it is, C commands the patient, not the other way around, and this needs to be represented. And
I think you're really going to need to finish up right now.
I'm finishing up now. And so, and also, of course, there is the question of whether it's only alpha and beta. Maybe there are also more nodes. And this actually brings us directly, if you look at the end of 18, this brings us directly to the decomposition question, which is the next question.
Great. Thank you very much.
Things to say about head selection, if I have time at the end. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Gillian now. So Hagit, if you unshare your screen, great. And Gillian, if you share yours. Gillian?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Lovely.
Yes. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that I went second here, so I didn't have to do the background. I'm going to start off basically by agreeing with Hagit that we've had a long and rich tradition of this, and we've discovered a lot of stuff. But things change, and science moves in the dialectic between empirical discoveries and theory construction. So I'm going to start off by throwing out or rethinking some of the very terms of the old, the way of framing this question. I want to frame it in a different way. I want to rethink the basic terms as is right and proper now, 50 years later. So what I would like to do is, yes, first say thematic relations. That does not mean theta roles. This is not the way I'm going to answer the question. How am I going to answer the question? Well, I think there's a sensible way of thinking about thematic relations. We need to forget the idea of thematic roles as in Grad Syntax 101, 1988. We need a more up-to-date definition for what I'm going to call the roaring 20s, because they've been pretty monstrous so far. And what I do take for granted, the way I'm going to think about the notion of a thematic relation, is a very sort of basic foundational idea that when you build up a proposition, I'm trying to advance my screen here and failing. When you build up a proposition, you need to establish a relationship between the functional sequence, which represents the eventuality, and a variety of different nominals, which are in relationship to that eventuality. So we need to integrate lexical and functional content corresponding to the description and labeling of eventualities with the lexical and functional content corresponding to the description and labeling of individuals and objects. And to do that, we need to establish relations between the DPs and the lower part of this extended verbal projection. And that's what I'm going to call thematic relations. Okay, so thematic role labels, the reason we had them in the first place is because they embodied the idea or the suspicion or the hope that there are linguistically relevant patterns, generalizations, distinctions between the different types of relations, that they form natural classes in some way. So are there those generalizations, and at what level of conceptual specificity do those generalizations occur in? And are these generalizations directly encoded in the syntax or not? So this I take to be the deep question that I'm trying to answer here. Now, we have learned a lot from the past 5 years of study here about the generalizations. I think these turn out to be quite spare, more spare than the traditional theta roles initially suggested. So let me just give you a couple of slides summarizing what I take to be the consensus or the state of the art, or that people who've been working on this for a lot of years kind of agree that there's a general pattern to argument structure generalizations. So first I want to give you a little slide giving you the, before I give you the slide, let me say that I absolutely agree with Hagit that I'm not thinking about these as generalizations about lexical meanings of verbs. I'm thinking of these, I want to turn it over on its head a little bit, I think in much the way that Hagit does, and talking about generalizations from structural representation. We start from the syntax and we ask, what is the generalizations between structure and regular semantic entailments? So actual lexical items form lists, chunks, clusters of constrained polysemies. So we cannot go from the lexical item. I think everybody working in this area realizes this. But if you go from the syntax, if you go from the structural representation and ask yourself, okay, what are the generalizations about how structure maps onto the semantics of argument structure relationships, then I think we are getting an emerging consensus here. And with respect to the external argument, it looks a little bit like this. In a dynamic eventuality, the causing participant is somehow privileged, whether that is animate, inanimate, abstract causes, facilitators, instrumentals, or whatever. And with respect to the inner argument, there's a generalization in that a participant that's defined in relation to the path of change, whether that's an undergoer or a result holder or a measure or a path descriptor or whatever, those are somehow privileged in the lower part of the event description. Right. Now, those are the generalizations in the consensus, but in fact, my own view of thematic relations is even more spare than this descriptive generalization might suggest. I actually think that the syntax affords only two basic ways. There are only two thematic relations. There are only two basic ways of allowing a DP to be semantically composed with an event description, and those are predication and unification. These are semantically distinct, and they do correspond to two different kinds of structural relationship in the syntactic representation. In classical traditional terminology, you might want to cash this out in terms of the specifier of a whole structural representation on the one hand versus the complement of a head. So you can see, actually, heretically, I'm not very interested in unit merge here. But we put that aside. What I'm interested in is building a theory in which there's a clear mutual feeding relationship between hierarchical relationships and the buildup of semantic information. Okay, so if we do this, then, and this is very spare, very minimalistic, then all the other rich properties of thematic relations, as we're maybe used to thinking them of, these have to be recouped via the very particular conceptual content attached to the verbal labels that end up in instantiating the rich syntactic structure. So
Gillian,
the answer to my question, my final slide, I give you the answer to the question. The question is, how are thematic relations expressed in the syntax? And my answer is, thematic relations, there are only two, are expressed in the syntax: predication, unification. End of story.
Great, thank you very much. So it's kind of interesting moderating something like this when you don't have a card, you can wave at someone. Stop! I mean, I normally just say stop, right? Anyway, thanks very much for that, Gillian. I'm going to pass straight over to Hagit for the second question.
Actually, you're not. The Gillian starts now.
Oh, are you doing it next?
So you just hold on.
Tell me that. Okay, Gillian is then going to
Sorry, I thought it was understood that we were alternating. It's okay.
Gillian is then going to continue to tell us a little bit more about verbal decomposition and argument structure. Back to you, Gillian.
Okay. If I can refine, there we go. Yes. So, well, that's pretty minimal. There's not much there. How do I get away with that? And this leads us nicely into question C, which is verbal decomposition and argument structure. Now, the reason one can get away with such a spare set of thematic relations is that the functional structure of the verbal decomposition does some of the work. And the big idea here is going to be that hierarchical representation of argument positions correlates with the hierarchical position of the sub-event that they are related to. Okay. Now let's recap what the generalizations about arguments, about event decomposition are, right? So event decomposition, that's been studied a lot by the semanticists, but also syntacticians. You can see morphological effects of building up events, and event complexity, whether you see it in the morphology or the syntax, there's generalizations here about how that maps onto hierarchy. And that's in this slide here, the causing event, when it can be seen to be explicitly added. So when we have evidence from the syntax, it always adds morphology or participants that are hierarchically, that's a reverse agreement error, above the core dynamic event. Result events are always added below the core dynamic event. Okay, so the cause head is always above, the result predictor is always below. So that is a rather robust typological generalization. And now what we note is, so what we're going to say is that, in fact, these layers also correspond to the argument structure generalization. So there's not two things here, there's going to be one thing, right? The hierarchical patterns of arguments and the hierarchical structuring of sub-events are in lockstep. So this did not have to be so from a logical point of view, but it is so over and over again in every language. So this is not an accident. This is not two things. This is one thing. We are not looking at two generalizations, just one. So to be concrete about it, I show you the tree that will be familiar to you from, if anyone's read my 2008 book, but the labels here don't really matter. And in fact, the labels are very semantic-y, but they're there as mnemonics, because really what the work that's being done is the idea that sub-evental, so each of these projections corresponds to a sub-event, embedding corresponds to causation or leads to, and then the arguments that are slotted in at the specifier levels are related by a simple kind of Aristotelian property predication over the property denoted by the particular sub-event. So there are the definitions of the roles here. If just taking predication and the sub-event into account, the highest specifier will be the holder of the property of this sub-event, which leads to the change. The middle specifier is a holder of a changing property, so that's the undergoer, and the lower predication expresses a property that comes into being because of a dynamic event. So if we do it this way, then you see the structure you get does two things. It gives you the structure and its proper subsets sort of grounds the typology of Oxionsart types that you find in languages. And it also derives the universals of argument structurings. You don't need an independent thematic hierarchy. You don't need any linking between the two. It's the one structure plus predication that does it all for you. So, am I out of time yet? My answer to C, I'm going to end each of my little spiels with the answer to the question. Question C, what is the relationship between verbal decomposition and argument structure? And my answer is, there is no relationship because it's just one thing.
Lovely, very minimalist. Okay, if you share your screen, Gillian, we can end the same question about the relationship between verbal decomposition and argument structure to Hagit.
Okay, I need to find my document. Because it's I have the whole screen up and I can't find it. Okay, fine. Okay, yeah, okay.
It's good. Gillian was very fast, so you know.
Not very
Sorry.
adept with all of this. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Okay, now I lost.
Go to share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, I already did that, but somehow it's not quite doing it.
Aha.
Do you have it?
We did. Well, you have your screen.
You have my screen. I don't have my screen.
I'm guessing that's an opera singer or something.
That is an opera singer. Very good. Okay. How did you guess?
Well, you know,
Huh?
it's you.
Okay. So here is question 2, what you have under B. You will see, this might seem very familiar from what Gillian was just talking about, because these are not necessarily the things that would distinguish between us. And that is that if we take this in continuation with what I said before to be some kind of a basic scheme, so in my particular way of looking at things, you have a particular scheme. The scheme, for me, what would correspond to the arguments, although there would be maybe perhaps other relationship between alpha and beta specifically, but what corresponds to arguments in this particular case are specifiers. And these are specifiers of particular nodes, alpha and beta in this particular case, and a good share of what I think the interpretation that emerges comes from what alpha and beta are. If we look, for instance, at classical neo-Davidsonian representations, which is more or less what you have in 27, notice that the neo-Davidsonian representations in 27 really only encode arguments. They only have, I mean, they would encode also modifiers, like in the yard or something like this. But as they stand in 27, they for the verb head, it would give us the 2 arguments for Parsons, in fact, even agent and patient. But let's just convert this to argument 1 and argument 2. And so we have 2 types of relationship with the event, one that we can call argument 1 and one that we can call argument 2. And the tacit assumption in neo-Davidsonian representations, for instance, as in Parsons, is that either this should be enough to give you the event type, just the configuration of roles should be enough to give you an event type, or you need something else that is outside this system, okay? But this is actually, first of all, I mean, to begin with, the notions of goal and of agent and patient in Parsons, they come from elsewhere, and we would like to integrate them into the system. We don't want a separate system that assigns roles. And those roles are assigned here. And in these particular kind of representations, we could say that the interpretation that we give to argument 1 and argument 2 are entailments from this particular structure, okay? So here are some things in B2 that if you look at the scheme, which is very, very schematic of what we need to do, what are alpha and beta semantically, and if both are connected to event structure in some sense, what is their nature, such as it gives us both a proper interpretation for the event under consideration and also a refinement of the type of role that each one of them is associated with. Second is what they are syntactically. Neo-Davidsonian representations are conjunctions. They're not hierarchically arranged. And so what is going to give us the fact, for instance, that an agent C-commands the patient, or the equivalent of agent would C-command the patient and not the other way around? What are the relationship between that particular scheme and other relatively well-established syntactic properties? For instance, structural case is typically restricted to 2 or possibly 3 positions. Does that bear on the elaboration in 26? So in 26, there are only 2. I think maybe, not in 26, yeah, 26, there are only 2. I think Gillian and I would not agree on whether there's a third or not. There was a third in Gillian's representation. There are only 2 quote unquote structural cases. And so the question is whether that is at all related to the number of arguments that we have, or is this just a coincidence that we don't have 7 cases and 3 arguments, or 2 arguments, or 7 arguments in 2 cases, whatever the case might be. This does not include a lot of stuff. So for instance, question B, which, as I already said, I don't have much to say about, allows for the possibility that agent and causes are distinct. And if they are, the structure doesn't allow for that. It also doesn't allow for the presence of other possible things in the object domain, maybe applicative, maybe benefactives of various sorts that people have argued might be in that domain. So that does not actually stick there. And I will not actually talk about that very much. What I will talk about are two things, time allowing. The one is what I think alpha and beta are, and the other thing is here because a lot of people ask me about this, and that is why I do not think there is a result chunk to this structure. So I've been playing with a chunk of structure which I call quantity, and quantity in the scheme that you have in 26 would be specifically beta. It would be within the domain of what alpha is, and alpha is just the entire event. You could think of it as a sub-event. I have particular reasons not to want to think about it as a sub-event, but it doesn't really actually matter. And what you have as the representation is you have, in fact, two arguments. One is an argument of the event itself, and the second one is the argument of quantity. And so you do, in fact, have a certain kind of embedding, maybe somewhat akin to what Gillian was talking about, but in a different conceptualization of what the semantics is all about and what the chunks are all about. And so the representation, as I believe it is to be really, and which is a bit of a departure actually from what I suggested in 2005, is in 33. You have an originator, which for me is a cover term for both causer and agent, without allowing the possibility that it's an overgeneralization. You have a quantity. The quantity is a property of the event. You might think about it as a modifier of the event. In fact, you might think about this. If you don't want to think about it as a sub-event, you can think about it as an adjunct. And then you have a subject of quantity, which is the subject of quantity. And finally, you have feed. This is Jane fed the dog. And this is specifically the representation for quantity events, which for me are telic events. So these are cases where what I get is if you wish, a result without a result. How much time do I have, David?
You're over time, so I think it's a good time to stop.
I will stop. I will stop, and people can ask me questions if they wish. Okay.
Aren't you going to go on to the next one anyway?
You can go on to the next one, and hopefully Gillian will have something to say. I'll have few things to say, not very many.
Okay, why don't you continue with the final question? So the final question is about the representation of causation and agentivity, and then we'll pass it back to Gillian, and then we'll wrap up with enough time for questions.
Okay. As you can see, I relabeled them. So this was in fact B in the flyer, but very rudimentary thoughts about agents and causes. And so I don't have many thoughts about agents and causers, not because I don't think there are such things as agent and causers, but because I didn't think very much about it, which is certainly something worth thinking about. So I really restricted myself to very few things. One is, I think there is sufficient empirical evidence to suggest that the distinction is real. I can go through at least a few cases that are all in the literature. So I believe Hale and Kaiser observed, and the examples in one are from Hebrew, that if you add an external argument to an intransitive, which is activity, which is an ergative, you get an agent reading. And if you add it to an unaccusative, which is not necessarily activity and not necessarily agentive itself, then you can get either agentive or causal reading. This is an example from Hebrew, and it's a kind of nice minimal pair. You have the trainer ran the horse to the stable, and you have the hunger ran the horse to the stable. Run to the stable presumably is a quantity event, so presumably this is an accusative representation. And this is not good with the hunger. I mean, the trainer can run the horse to the stable, but not the hunger. But if the horse is just running around, this is fine. So the trainer ran the horse in the stable, around and around, or the hunger ran the horse in the stable, around and around. These are both good. under the assumption that hunger is a causer but not an agent. This gives us a contrast. It's well known that only agentive subjects can control pro. Subjects of ing nominals, things like the kissing of the bride or something like that, they must be agentive. You have an example. So the wall touched the fence has a perfectly sensible reading without asking the wall to actually agentively touch the fence. They're just kind of in a touching relationship. But once you turn it into a nominal, that reading goes away. The touching of the fence is not possible for this to be the wall, because an agentive reading is required. Hebrew biphrases must be agentive. So these all suggest that that there is a distinction between agents and causers. At least one thought that is frequently floated relative to this is that agents are higher. They represent a higher event. So if you throw a ball, for instance, there is the event of you throwing, and then there is a completely separate event of the ball moving through space. But if the hunger ran the horse to the stable, then there is no event that the hunger participates in, which is separate from the event of the horse running to the stable. And I think this is an attractive possibility, but there's something counterintuitive about this, and that is the fact that agents are usually very direct. They are very much involved in the event, but causers do not need to have either locational or temporal adjacency to the event that they are causing. So that seems to create, and in fact, sometimes even get adversarial relationship, like for instance, the cancellation improved my mood, or the virus created antibodies in the blood. It's not the virus that created the antibodies, it's the presence of the virus that triggered for somebody else to do the creation. So these are all cases where it's a little bit difficult to see how cancellation or virus are really more of a part of the event than, let's say, my immune system created antibodies in the blood. So I've finished all my thoughts.
Cool.
And Gillian, if you have more articulate thoughts, I would be certainly very, very happy to hear.
Thank you very much, Hagit. Okay, so if you unshare your screen, then we'll pass over to Gillian to complete. Then I'll do a very brief summary and we'll move to questions.
Okay, I'm going to share now. Okay. So that was the previous question. And now we move on to the last question, which was B on our poster. What about causation and agentivity? Are they the same? Are they different? In what way are they different? As we have seen so far, as I have argued so far, causation is a very important thing in the structural representation. It plays an important role in the structuring of event descriptions. And this is extremely robust cross-linguistically. If you see the quote there from Levine and Rappaport-Val, if you don't want to believe me, believe them. They say that that's one of the things that nobody argues with. It just seems to be completely true cross-linguistically, that the embedding relations among arguments and event structure are always respected in argument realization, and the more embedded arguments receiving less prominent syntactic realizations. And causation is the way to embed one sub-event under another. And yeah, see also Hegel and Kaiser on that. So no surprises that I think that causation is important. And of course, causation, because the arguments are put in lockstep with the event structure decomposition, that's going to have an indirect effect on the thematic roles. But so causers are going to be hierarchically privileged arguments. But as you see from this slide here, I've given some examples sort of similar to Hagit's examples, but I'm going to make a slightly different conclusion from it. If you look at these examples, you see there's many, many different ways to be a cause. So cause is a rather underspecified notion. The way I'm using it, the way I think it you can see that it's linguistically relevant and hierarchically relevant. It's very underspecified. So you can get lots of subjects that are different kinds of causes. You can have an intentional agent, as in 1A. You can have an inanimate cause, as in 1B. You can have an instrumental cause, as in 1C. An inanimate object in motion can cause physical effects. An event can cause, even a state of event in 1F can cause stuff to happen. And in many languages, I mean, any languages which are, any tests and linguistic tests that are directly diagnosing hierarchy, and I'm going to be really strict here, diagnosing hierarchy, there's no evidence to me that agents have a special hierarchical relationship to the kind of event structure decompositions we're thinking of. So I leave that slide up and I'm going to talk for a while because, of course, what Hagit says is right. There are many, many ways in which agents behave differently linguistically. But I think we have to be careful, because when we see agents behaving differently, there's always a number of different ways to get that to fall out. And not all of those are about syntactic structure. So the claim, I'm just gonna go all out here, all on a limb, nail my colors to the mast, and I'm gonna say that at the level of syntactic, let me make sure I say this properly. At the level of syntactic generalization, there's no reason to encode the difference between agents and causes directly in the syntax. I have found no compelling reason that forces me to do so. Causation is represented in the syntactic hierarchy, but the specific fact of agentivity only comes when this underspecified concept gets unified with the specific lexical content of a particular verb, combined with real-world knowledge. And when you see differences between transitive verbs and unaccusatives, that's because the transitive verb has lexical content which imposes semantic selection on the agent. But if you causativize an unaccusative with a null causative head, there is no such lexical content imposing any semantic selectional restrictions. So there, I've thought about how to do this, how to distinguish agents and causes, sort of forcing myself to be as minimal as possible in what I put in the syntax. And I've so far, I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but so far I've not been convinced that I need to do it for agents. So some verbs, by the nature of their meaning, will give rise to agent causers. They specify a specific kind of causing event, which actually says it has to be an agent, but this is semantic selection, to use the traditional term. I do not think, for example, that subevental heads or functional heads in the syntax introducing arguments, of which I have none, by the way, need to come in flavors representing a specifically agentive notion. Now, agents are a particularly common kind of causer, because I would freely admit that human beings pay close attention to the distinction of sentience and internal affect. So both for the external arguments and the internal arguments, so experiencers and things like that, distinguishing and tracking animacy all the time, not just in the verbal domain, but also in the nominal domain. But this is not a part of the universal scaffolding of hierarchical representation. Rather, it's a regular conceptual feature employed to distinguish lexical contents. To be sure, there are many specific languages, some languages that grammaticalize agent marking, but this is done via language particular devices, and that's akin to having particular case markers at your disposal or particular prepositions at your disposal. Some languages have by and from, and some make a distinction and some do not, but this is a language specific lexical content matter. They are easily and commonly learned, so it's pervasive. They're all over the place. That's why we keep picking them out. But agency per se is not a syntactic feature or baked into the universal spine. Unlike causation, which I would argue is a deep property of the linguistic structural system, a piece of semantics which is highly correlated with structure. So when I try to correlate with hierarchy per se, as opposed to it behaves differently with respect to some linguistic test, the only thing that correlates is causation, not the more specific notion of agentivity.
Gillian, time to wind up, yeah?
Yep. Agency is a cognitively pervasive way of classifying both individuals and the events they participate in, but not a necessary structuring principle. So the answer to the question, what is the relationship between causation and agentivity? As I say, I'm going to stick my neck out here. Causation is a SynSem structuring principle for eventualities. Agency is a cognitive conceptual notion found in both the individual and event dimensions.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So if you unshare your screen, we don't have a great deal of time to do questions, and I have a lot. I think there will be quite a few questions coming. So I'm going to very briefly sum up what I see as some of the things that arose out of that. And I'm going to do it from a fairly high level perspective, because so the question really, I think, is to what extent do the discussions about event structure, verbal decomposition, argument structure that you both talked about, how do they really inform us as to what the general nature of the syntax semantics interface was? And I thought Hagit's initial discussion of this was really interesting in picking up on David Pozetsky's early quote that essentially had the semantics, feeding into or motivating the nature of what the autonomous syntax would be. And that's sort of been turned on its head, I think, and over the last decade or so, maybe a bit longer, where, longer than that, where semantics is really an interpretation of the autonomous syntax. But I think actually what I see in both of your works, maybe more in Gillian's than in Hagit's, but there's a sort of sense in which actually perhaps the syntax, at least the compositional aspects of semantics, are the same kind of the same thing looked at from different perspectives. Now that is challenged by a point that Hagit made, which is, if you have a conjunctive approach to your semantics, a neo-Davisonian approach, then of course conjunction is associative, so not hierarchical. So there is still some kind of distinction perhaps between what you think the semantic representation might look like and what the syntactic one might look like. Also, the relationship between them may be that they really are the same thing. It's just that one perspective loses some information that's held in the other perspective and vice versa. Connected to that, I thought it was a really interesting question that came up really near the end in especially Gillian's comments about, and actually Hagit's comments earlier on in answer to the second question, about the nature of category and what these actual categories are that populate the hierarchical structure, and whether we have things like flavors, or whether that is really something that really shouldn't be in the syntax at all. So those are my very brief thoughts from a fascinating conversation. Our very first question comes from Heidi Harley. And I think Cecilia will be able to unmute Heidi. Heidi, are you there?
No, actually, Heidi is on YouTube, so I will read it aloud because it came out with my email. And it's a question for Gillian. And she says, regarding the core division between specifier predication and complement co-composition and unification, you gave a list of various roles associated with each. Can you comment on how you view created objects of words like build, bake, on one reading, etc. fit? Do you think of them as complements or specifiers? And this is Heidi Harley.
Thanks for the question, Heidi. Yes, I had no time to go into all the different types of arguments there would be and where I would place each one. I think for the most of the creation verbs I've seen, the objects of creation verbs are complements. They're part of the path structure, and they define the path of the event. They are not individuated objects which then undergo a change. They're not pre-individuated and then they do something. Something is predicated of them. No, they are part of the unfolding of the dynamic event itself. They are part of the event path. They grow as the event path. They are part of the path. They're like a path. They're a creation path.
Hagit, did you want to add anything to that?
Just a clarification. I wasn't sure where they are in your structure. When they are objects, as you say, complements, where are they in your structure?
They're in the complement of the head of the
complement
process.
Of which head?
Process head.
And so that means that in these particular cases, there won't be a result.
That's right.
Okay, so these
well,
are.
I think there are some creation verbs which probably should be. So there's some creation verbs which end up with somebody possessing something, created and possessed. I think those probably do have some null result structure, but the standard ones I think Heidi is probably thinking of. I mean, I would need to see the exact verb, but the standard ones would probably just be complement of process.
Okay, so you have a difference between, let's say, John built the house and John broke the window.
Yes.
Okay. So
Okay.
one has the result and one doesn't.
Yes.
So we have another question from Alessandra Giorgi, who my apologies for thinking that Heidi was around and not on YouTube. It's my fault. But we have hopefully we have Alessandra around. Alessandra, are you there?
Hello. Hi. My question concerns the relationship between argument structure and aspect, and in particular, I would like to ask the speakers what they think about the relation between telicity and perfectivity.
I can answer this, and I think I know Gillian will have things to say beyond whatever it is that I will say. I have an account of telicity, and my account of telicity is actually invested in the notion that telicity is not related to tense, and that you're going to get telicity regardless of temporal relationship. And quite possibly, though, I mean, this is still not maybe as well developed as I would like, but I think telicity may be related to a local relationship, but that still needs to be further developed. It certainly intuitively corresponds to, let's say, the choice of particles that induce telicity, typologically speaking. What I think in my years of attempting to understand what people mean by perfectivity, mostly what I concluded is that you have to probe quite a bit before you know what you're talking about. Some people talk about perfectivity and they mean telicity, and some people talk about perfectivity and they mean perfect, as in English, and some people talk about perfectivity and they mean a certain set of markers. But if we take perfectivity to be some kind of what people sometimes refer to as a viewpoint aspect, I think this is actually a relationship that treads in temporal relationship and organizes a temporal relationship. And so for me, these are separate. There could be, for instance, inside derived nominals, you do get telicity, but you do not get grammatical aspect of the type that I think I would like the word perfectivity and perfectivity to single out that portion. So that's basically my answer. There are, I think there are languages where you find one grammatical formative that might do both jobs. And that's an interesting question, but you also find across the functional structure, sometimes cases where you have a single formative doing more than just one functional job. So that's not necessarily that surprising. Okay, that's my answer. Okay. Gillian has more on viewpoint aspects, so she may have a lot more to say.
No, I mean, I actually think that we've got some good candidates for nice, clear, clean semantic definitions of what telicity is. I think of telicity as being an event structure that's somehow atomic. It's, you know, I agree with Hagit, it's not necessarily a temporal notion. The word perfectivity is much more fraught, in my opinion. I think that as I've looked at it, perfectivity in Russian is not the same, even distributionally, than perfectivity in Romance or perfectivity in any of the other languages you might choose to study, which use the term perfective versus imperfective. So I think that it's an impossible question to answer. I think that the only way to do it is to look at the particular language and see how the word's been used, and then try to match it up with, make a very clear semantic definition that makes predictions, and then see, because right now we're really wallowing in so much confusion with respect to the use of that term.
I totally agree.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions. The first one is from David Pozetsky, and then after that, Alexis Wellwood. So first of all, David.
Hi, thank you. So this question was prompted by some remarks of Gillian's at the beginning and then at the end, but it's for both speakers. So there's a well-known puzzle concerning causatives that for binding theory and variable binding purposes, causal subjects behave as if they at least have some part of their life in a very low position, right? So this is most famous in the domain of psych verbs. Each other's remarks annoyed John and Mary, but you could duplicate it for periphrastic causatives. Made John and Mary annoyed gives you the same judgments, and a bunch of other cases. And this repeats itself. This is distinguished from comparable agentive constructions, where you don't get this kind of backward binding possibility. So people have, including me and Belletti and Rizzi and other people, have tried to understand this in terms of a low position for causatives that's distinct from the absence of such a low position for agents. And particularly in light of a theory in which you don't have to say anything about where the arguments go once you understand how the verbs work, and particularly in light of the fact that you get this kind of data with paraphrastics. I'm wondering how you would think about these contrasts.
I have a very short question, and that is, I already said, I think that it's an attractive proposition. First of all, I do think there is a distinction, so I differ from Gillian on that. And secondly, I think that the causer probably is lower. I did present a number of what I thought were prima facie counterintuitive.
But it has to be lower than the lowest other arguments, right?
That as I said, I won't venture a position on something I didn't think about sufficiently. So.
Thank you. Julia?
Yeah, I'm aware of those funny backwards binding facts with psych verbs, of course, but I was always inclined to blame the experiencer.
So it's not it's not complete. Well, of course, we have to know what the experiencer is guilty of.
Yeah.
but also, I think it's not limited completely to experiencer constructions, right? So things like each other's criticisms harmed John and Mary. People judge as better than, each other's friends invited John and Mary, and so on. And so it's not just about experiences.
Yeah, I mean, in presenting my view, I skirted over some of the complexities. I do actually believe there's a high position for a kind of a event structure topic. There's a high argument position. It's probably one that I think both Heidi and I would, we've discussed the problem of little v, and I think she ended up convincing me that we need cause and the position for the external argument to be higher. And there are certain, you would hope that it would just be proximity. There's certain rules which choose which of the arguments in the actual event decomposition gets chosen as the external argument for the purposes of the event description. I think something funny is going on with those psych verbs. I think it's got to do with the feeding of the subject position, and I agree that's really interesting. I don't think it can be solved by putting the agent higher or low. I think you just get into paradoxes. So I would rather solve it another way.
Thank you.
Great. So we now have a question from Alexis Wellwood, and then we'll finish off with a question from YouTube after that Cecilia will read. So Alexis, so you're around?
Okay, yep. Thank you, David. And thanks, Gillian and Hagit. It's great to see you both. So my question was about, Hagit was talking about epistemological priorities, or where these roles come from. And I take it that this is sort of a question about the relationship between language and thought. And also related to questions like, where does the hierarchy of projections come from, right? There's this invitation when you look at the content of the projections and how they're ordered to think, oh, that makes sense in some kind of way. It makes sense that this would come before that, et cetera. So I was wondering, and I think the idea that something like conceptual structure or the structure of thoughts or whatever you want is helping to determine the sorts of information that we see and the order that it comes in, I think invites us to a better idea of how we might come up with an independent theory against which we can test specific proposals about the ordering and about the specific content of the rules, et cetera. So I was wondering, Hagit, if you could just say a bit more about your own position on this, and then Gillian, if you could say where you land in response.
Okay, I think this is, to me, a fascinating question. Thank you. I'll start maybe with the hierarchical structure, just at the scheme. And I think the scheme is not coming from any conceptual anything. I think the scheme is the scheme. If you ask me where it comes from, and you can kill me if you all want to kill me, I think it comes from phonology. I think it comes from a segmental relationship within phonology, cycles within phonology, and so on and so forth. Phonology not in the sense of syllable structure and voicing, but in the sense of larger phonological organizations. And I think that's prior to the syntactic organization. The question then becomes a question of labeling. The question that you ask is then a question of labeling. If you have a hierarchical structure formed by merge or formed by whichever mechanism we have, which will give us a certain kind of scheme, and which is driven, in my view, not by any conceptual considerations as such. It's not from the language of thought where it comes from. The question is how we populate it and what the relationship is between those different things, okay? In my more cynical days, I will tell you that all arguments that I have seen whereby X has to dominate Y or X has to C command Y are circular. You've built the semantics to tell you that this is what it is. So, I mean, we can establish semantic relationship. Look at the relationship between C and T. We all know there is a relationship between C and T. We don't want to question that in a language such as English, there is a relationship between C and T. Why does this relationship have to be C above T? Why does it not, is not T over C? Why is it not that TP is the specifier of C? Why is it not that the CP is the specifier of T? These are all, we have no principal semantics that could exclude this. And or people say, okay, you know, it's intuitive that tense is above aspect, but in actuality, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense for aspect to scope over tense, because it's if it's a form of division of tense. And so I think we have come up with some sub-relationship between items on the functional sequence, which I think we can say there is a dependence there, and the dependence works in a particular way. And if we put the labels just so, we will get empirical results. I would like to think one day we will know, because that will need to come from somewhere. That's not going to come from phonology, I can assure you, okay? So even if, let's say, merge and the building of the hierarchy itself comes from someplace else, which is not semantically driven at all, the labeling or whatever is doing the work of labeling, if you don't like labeling, whatever it is that's giving us the fact that this chunk of structure interacts with the chunk above it or below it in a particular way, and why it's below it and not above it, and so on. I hope it will come from something, but I don't think, my sense is that all the rationales that I've seen so far had this nature, that we've established a dependence between two items, but the dependence doesn't actually give us the hierarchy as it stands. It's circular.
Okay, I think we should give Gillian a chance to answer that now.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for the question. I love the question. I completely disagree with Hagit. I think it's just not good enough to throw up our hands and say, no, it's syntax and it's all circular and we'll never discover this. I think this is exactly my agenda. I think that no. I think that what I want to do is get a theory that is going to be exactly able to deliver so ways in which one could, well, make predictions for, okay, well, then the brain must be set up this way. Or if we test some cognitive thing, we'll find this. Or we expect that. And to me, it's not enough to just say that there's a template. I want to understand why the template the way it is. Right now, maybe we are in a position where those arguments are circular, but the goal has to be to take to build our semantic theories. I don't think our semantic theories are actually built in a way as to help us make these predictions, by the way, which is another one of my agendas, to try to make semantic theory a little bit more responsive to explaining why the syntactic hierarchy is the way it is. But I agree we're not there yet. We're still going round in circles. But the only way to get out of that loop is to have theories where we, again, nail our colors to the mast and say, I think it's like this because the cognitive systems that language is embedded in, after all, language is our best, most rich source of evidence about detailed sort of cognitive processing in humans. So we say that it works this way because of certain ways that the cognitive system works, and then specifically make predictions and go out and test and be falsified and come back and change our view again. So I welcome all suggestions for how to sharpen the SIN-SEM claims and sharpen the theory so as to be able to make claims that are testable cognitively, psychologically, and discussed philosophically.
If I may say, I think what you need is not syntactic theories that could do it, but cognitive theories that could do it, because that's where I think that
we need to be talking to each other.
Ah, this is a very good thing. Okay, so that sounded like starting off with total disagreement and ending up with agreement, which is very nice. Cecilia, do we still have time for that last YouTube question?
Well, if it is, if your answers are sort of short, I could at least ask the question and then, you decide. So the question is asked by Serkan Karakas, and the question is, in the recent literature, middles do not exist, but it is just a mere meaning, Fabregas, Putnam, etc. How would each speaker account for middle interpretations? And why do some languages use active structure for middles and some use passives?
Well, okay, you have 1 minute each on this. Starting with Hagit and then Gillian.
A little bit like the perfectivity question. So could you say what you mean by middle? Because not all people mean the same thing when they say middle. The middle in English, for instance, is very different from what's been called middle in Romance. There's no particular reason to assume they have the same structure.
Okay, Gillian.
Yes, the middle is a derived category. I have primitives that will account for particular middle behaviors, but I don't think it's a unified thing.
That was beautifully answered, both of you. Thank you very much. Okay, so with that last question, we bring today's very exciting discussion to a close. And before handing back to Cecilia, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for coming, and a huge thank you to Hagit and Gillian for such a fascinating discussion. Cecilia, back to you.
Well, thank you all
for wonderful cheering.
Yes, well, please stop your, yes, thank you. So this is our screen sharing now. You know that at the end of each epic battle, I generally thank our Pagian group and the group of the Linguistic Aperitif of the universities of Northern and Central Italy. And I announce our new meeting. Well, the Linguistic Aperitif goes on holiday. So the next one will be on September the 10th. It's still a Thursday. It's still at 6:30 Central European time. This time, the topic is language in the brain. The two discussants will be Andrea Moro from the Istituto Universitario di Studi Superiori Pavia and David Purple from New York University and MPI Empirische Ästhetik Frankfurt am Main. You can see already the questions, but we will circulate them around. The moderator will be Maria Teresa Guasti from the Università degli Studi di Milano Bicocca, and she is one of the members of the Linguistic Aperitif. I really thank everybody who helped us to do this, especially our younger colleagues, Enrico Castro, Ake Huben, Tommaso Balsemin, Tommaso Mattiuzzi, Francesco Pinzin, Giacomo Presotto, and Yang Yusun. Stay safe and have a nice summer. So this is the organizing committee that you can read by yourself. Good night and see you in September.
Thank you.
Ciao, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.